At the age of 12, this young man's testimony helped convict the man who murdered his mother. 5 years later, discrepancies in the autopsy led him to question if the murdered woman really was his mother. If it wasn't, an innocent man had been sent to prison. This well-manicured neighborhood in Mansfield, Ohio, was home to one of the most successful doctors in town. Dr. John Boyle, known as Jack to family and friends, had built up a thriving medical practice in Mansfield that was the envy of his colleagues.
He had what the investigators called the largest medical practice in Richland County. 1 out of 13 people, and we have 130,000 people living in Richland County, used Dr. Boyle as their physician.
Jack and his wife, Noreen, had been married for more than 20 years. Noreen enjoyed the status they had achieved in the community.
She was one who liked to kind of maybe put on some airs, and she was very interested in social status, and I think was concerned about what people thought of her.
The couple had 2 children, a 12-year-old son, Collier, and a 2.5-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, whom they adopted from Taiwan. From outward appearances, they appeared to be a happy family. But Jack Boyle had a not-so-well-kept secret. Jack was having numerous sexual affairs with other women. Noreen knew about Jack's affairs, but according to friends, looked the other way in an effort to keep the family together. But it wasn't long until Collier was old enough to figure things out for himself. Especially after seeing his father kiss another woman romantically. For Noreen, this was the last straw, and she filed for divorce. Jack Boyle had been planning to move his medical practice to Erie, Pennsylvania, about 3 hours away. He asked Noreen to join him there to make a fresh start. On New Year's Day in 1990, Noreen Boyle missed a lunch date with her best friend, who called police to report her missing.
Collier, did you hear anything the other night?
Well, I heard Mom and Dad arguing.
Collier Boyle and his grandmother told investigators that Noreen and Jack had an argument on New Year's Eve, and that Noreen left home after the argument.
So if you looked at the actual circumstances, they were believable. The fact that she walked out the door, she was very upset. I don't know whether other issue may have come up, maybe another girlfriend or something like that, and would have caused her to just up and leave. And that's not beyond belief. It's not even unusual in our business.
Ma'am, can you tell me where Dr. Boyle is?
Jack left for Erie in the morning.
Do you know what he's doing there?
Dr. Boyle's mother said Jack left after breakfast for Erie, Pennsylvania, to work on the new home he had purchased. Noreen Boyle's friends were suspicious. They doubted that Noreen would ever leave home without her children. But Dr. Boyle had no history of domestic violence, and his mother said she heard nothing unusual or suspicious on the night Noreen disappeared. Days passed. There was no word from Noreen Boyle. People in Mansfield wondered if she'd left town to get away from her husband's infidelities, or if she was a victim of foul play. In January of 1990, Noreen Boyle, the pretty 44-year-old wife of a prominent physician in Mansfield, Ohio, had been reported missing. Family members said the couple argued on New Year's Eve, and Jack said Noreen left the home after the argument. But a neighbor who was awake that night said he didn't see anyone leave the Boyle residence between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. Police searched the Boyles' home, looking for evidence of violence.
When we arrived on Hawthorne Lane, we were fully staffed. We had the lab coats. We went in to process the scene for the potential evidence of maybe a homicide happened. And when we got done, we pretty much just shrugged our shoulders and left.
The day after Noreen disappeared, Jack Boyle had driven to Erie, Pennsylvania, where he had planned to move his medical practice. When police looked into the couple's background, they discovered that Jack Boyle was a serial philanderer who had a number of extramarital relationships which were known to the entire family. In one instance, Collier saw his father kiss and hug a woman named Sherry Campbell, whom he introduced as his good friend.
Collier, this is Sherry.
Hi,
Daddy's
nice
friend.
to meet you. How are you?
Good, how are you?
What caught Collier's attention was that Sherry Campbell was wearing a ring that belonged to his mother.
As a lowlife type of thing was take his wife's jewelry, steal it from his wife, and then place it on his mistress' finger and acted like he bought that ring specifically for Sherry Campbell.
Just 6 weeks before Noreen Boyle disappeared, the couple had purchased a new home in Erie, Pennsylvania. But the signature on the purchase agreement was that of N. Sherry Boyle, which was not Noreen's middle name, and the description given by the real estate agent did not match Noreen Boyle.
The real estate agent described the young lady that was with Dr. Boyle as being pregnant and very young, and certainly that didn't resemble the photos that I had of Noreen, who was a little bit older and blonde-haired, attractive woman.
Also suspicious was that Jack Boyle didn't negotiate the sales price. He agreed to pay the full asking price in exchange for the seller's promise to be out of the home by January 1st. David Messmore suspected that Boyle may have had a specific reason why he wanted to have possession of the Erie home by January 1st, and why he was making frequent trips there following his wife's disappearance. Messmore took a calculated risk and visited Collier Boyle at school so he could speak to the boy alone.
Collier, is there anything more you can tell me about the fight you heard between your parents the other night?
Well, I heard a big thump coming from my parents' room.
Collier was even more forthcoming than he had been in earlier interviews.
My father walked down the hall.
Collier was awakened by a loud thump. Shortly after that, his father, he heard him walking down the hallway to his room. And he remembers his father opening the door and looking in at him for a long period of time.
And did anything happen the next day? Did he say anything to you the next morning?
Well, he told me Mom went on a little vacation.
And Collier had more information about his father's trips to Erie.
Collier also told me that after his father got back from that weekend in Erie, his shoulders and arms were very sore, and Collier had to rub liniment on him, which was unusual.
A check of local businesses revealed Jack Boyle had rented a jackhammer from the Easy Rental Center in Mansfield a few days before Noreen disappeared, and had also purchased a roll of indoor-outdoor carpet. The realtor who sold Dr. Boyle his new home told investigators that he asked some unusual questions about the property.
He said that, is there a chance that I could lower the floor in the basement because my kids like to play basketball downstairs?
So when we put together those two pieces of evidence that he wanted to lower the basement floor and he rented a jackhammer and his wife was missing,
investigators suspected that it was Dr. Boyle's mistress, Sherry Campbell, who signed Noreen Boyle's name to the sales agreement, and that Sherry Campbell was pregnant with Jack Boyle's baby. The next step was to look inside Dr. Boyle's new home. Just over 3 weeks after Noreen Boyle disappeared, police got a search warrant for Jack Boyle's new home in Erie, Pennsylvania. Investigators knew Dr. Boyle had rented a jackhammer a few days before his wife disappeared. And the Dr. Boyle had been making almost daily trips to Erie during the 3 weeks his wife had been missing. This is the police videotape of that search. In the garage, police found the new green indoor-outdoor carpeting Jack Boyle had recently purchased, but little else. From there, police checked the basement. The floor had recently been painted gray, and new shelves installed at one end.
So as the technicians were on the floor and looking around, one of them went over to the wall of the concrete block basement and said, "There's a little bit of new concrete. It's like a mortar or something. It's kind of soft." At that point, after we knocked down the shelving and pulled up the indoor-outdoor carpeting, it was apparent that there was a little depression in the floor.
Carefully, they dug a small hole. Police smelled the strong odor of decomposition. Beneath the freshly poured concrete was the nude, badly decomposed body of a middle-aged woman, her head covered with a plastic bag. She was wearing an expensive Rolex watch with Noreen Boyle's initials engraved on the back. The watch had stopped on December 31st, the day Noreen Boyle disappeared. To identify the body, a forensic odontologist compared the victim's teeth to dental x-rays of Noreen Boyle.
After he completed his work, he looked at those, made the comparisons, and actually in the morgue announced this is this person. He made the identification that the victim was in fact Noreen Boyle.
The autopsy concluded that Noreen Boyle was suffocated after she was struck on the head with a blunt object. Prosecutors now knew why Jack Boyle wanted to take possession of his new home earlier than the sellers originally wanted to vacate.
Because it was part of the murder plot to kill her on the early morning hours of December 31st, 1989, and he wanted to have a funeral place for the burial, and that was this new home that he wanted in before January 1st, 1990. That was part of the murder plan or plot or this prior calculation and design.
That plan also included the rental of the jackhammer and Dr. Boyle bringing his mother home so she could babysit while he disposed of the body. But prosecutors could find no evidence that the body was transported to Erie in Jack Boyle's car.
We did vacuum sweepings from all the cars. We tried to see if there was any association with a victim in the car that would not be normal, and there was really nothing that was drawn of any value from the analysis of the Bureau.
And the plastic bag found wrapped around Noreen's head did not contain any identifiable fingerprints. A couple of days later, investigators found over a ton of concrete chips in Mansfield, Ohio, on a deserted piece of property owned by a business associate of Dr. Boyle, who also happened to be the uncle of Sherry Campbell, Dr. Boyle's girlfriend.
And it was shaped up like you'd put dirt on top of a burial plot. It was actually molded and shaped, this concrete, as if somebody was buried underneath it.
And a witness reported seeing Dr. Boyle in his pickup truck near the place where the concrete chips were found. To find out whether the cement debris came from the basement floor in the Erie home, investigators took samples to Larry Piscitelli at CTL Engineering. Piscitelli performed what is called a petrographic analysis.
Based on our analysis, we were able to show that the sample that came out of that pile of concrete debris in Mansfield, Ohio, matched the sample that came out of the original basement floor slab in Erie, Pennsylvania, and therefore they were both from the same structure.
Prosecutors believed they had an open and shut case until a family member delivered a bombshell the news that Noreen Boyle was still alive.
I think I could do that. Sure, that sounds like a really good idea. Why don't you send me the...
On the night Noreen Boyle disappeared, she was on the telephone with a girlfriend when her husband Jack came home with his mother, who was visiting for the holidays.
Well, I guess Jack isn't going to murder me tonight because his mother is spending the night.
But prosecutors believe that was exactly Jack's plan, to murder Noreen that night while his mother was there so she could babysit the children as he got rid of the body. Also part of this plan was Jack taking possession of his new home by January 1st and the rental of the jackhammer. Sometime after midnight on New Year's Day, 1990, the Boyles argued, and Jack struck his wife on the head in their bedroom. He tied a plastic bag around her neck, wrapped her in a tarpaulin, and carried the body out to his car. Then Jack looked in on Collier to see if he might have heard anything. Collier said he pretended to be asleep. The next morning, Boyle drove his wife's body to his new home in Erie, Pennsylvania, 3 hours away. Boyle used the jackhammer to dig Noreen's grave, then filled the hole with newly mixed concrete. The indoor-outdoor carpeting was placed on top. He transported the concrete debris back to Mansfield to get rid of the evidence of the burial.
I think Dr. Boyle was theorizing that he was going to have a very successful practice. He was going to make a lot of money in Erie, Pennsylvania. He was going to move there, and he was going to have a girl that he had had a relationship with and was about to have a baby with at his side. He wanted to have his other 2 children with him, but he didn't want Noreen around. So in his mind, that was a successful conclusion to this whole situation, is to just remove her from the scene.
I think John Boyle is somebody who has himself convinced he didn't do this, but I think that he's a pathological liar. I think that he had lied to people throughout his life. He lied to his wife about his girlfriends. He lied to his girlfriends about his other girlfriends. He lied to people about his military experience. I think he was such a good liar, he believed those lies.
Dr. Jack Boyle was charged with first-degree murder in the death of his wife, and the key witness against him was his own son, who told jurors of his father's infidelities.
I told her, I said, "Mom, please sit down." And she says, "Why, Collier?" I said, "Just please sit down. There's something I have to tell you." And she said, "Okay." I said, "I think Daddy has a girlfriend." And then she said, "Well, Collier, that's impossible. He can't have a girlfriend." And I explained to her that Daddy had kissed her and hugged her and stuff like that. And I admitted to my mother that I did, and she said, "That's okay." She said, "I knew I was in an impossible position."
Collier also told the jury what he heard from his parents' bedroom on the night his mother disappeared.
I heard a thud, a little.
Okay, could you describe this sound for us?
Okay, it was about this loud. And then about a minute and a half later, I heard, half a minute later, I heard a thud like this. It was even louder. And at that time, I was petrified. I was just scared.
We, the jury in this case.
The jury found Dr. Boyle guilty and sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole for 20 years. But the story doesn't end there. After the trial, Jack Boyle's brother said Noreen Boyle had called him on January 2nd, 1990, 2 days after her supposed murder. He said he wanted to testify at the trial, but had not been called. Maintaining his innocence from his prison cell, Jack Boyle also contended that the coroner had misidentified the victim.
There certainly are discrepancies that warrant a review of the autopsy, a very careful review of the autopsy, in particular because of the capital case. It's my personal opinion that the body is not that of Noreen.
To back up his claims, he pointed out discrepancies in the autopsy which described the body in the basement as having the wrong eye color, the wrong height, the wrong weight, described the victim as having no gallbladder, and with an intact appendix.
Noreen had an appendectomy. Appendices do not grow after they're removed. It just doesn't happen physiologically.
Joining him in the request for exhumation was his son Collier, who by this time was 16 years old. He too was concerned about the discrepancies in the autopsy. Now, almost 5 years later, he wanted to make sure it was his mother's body police found in the basement. The body was exhumed and tested using a mitochondrial DNA analysis, which confirmed what the prosecution always contended. The body was that of Noreen Boyle.
That was where he tried to poke a hole, and a major hole, in the prosecution's case. But forensic evidence actually backfired on him and showed conclusively that it was in fact Noreen Boyle.
The autopsy report did contain some factual errors, but in the end, DNA testing left no doubt and provided some closure for Collier Boyle. Scientific proof that his suspicions on the night his mother disappeared were, unfortunately, correct.
Well, I don't think there's ever any way to erase the hurt that's inside him. To have your father kill your mother is probably the most devastating thing that could ever happen to you. And so I think he's always going to suffer with that until hopefully time heals that and maybe puts that in the back of his mind instead of the forefront.
Decades after Adolf Hitler terrorized Europe, a high-ranking religious figure in the United States, Archbishop Valerian Trifa, was embroiled in controversy. Romanian immigrants identified Archbishop Trifa as a man with a secret past, responsible for the murders of hundreds of Jews during the war. Trifa denied it. To see whether Trifa played a role in these horrific war crimes, the United States government looked for scientific proof.
Sir, could you confirm your name for me, please?
My name is Viorel Trifa.
In 1950, a Romanian immigrant, Viorel Trifa, came to the United States to start a new life. Trifa told United States immigration officials that he was a victim of the Nazis during the war. He said that when he left his native Romania, he was taken prisoner by the German Gestapo. He said he was held at the Dachau concentration camp and was lucky to escape with his life. After the war, he said he struggled to survive, and then, like hundreds of thousands of refugees, came to America under the Displaced Persons Act.
The Displaced Persons Act was a statute enacted by the U.S. Congress and signed by the President in 1948 that had the noble purpose of rescuing victims of persecution in Europe who were languishing in the so-called DP camps and resettling them in the United States, where life would be better.
This is a copy of one of the forms Trifa filled out for entry into this country. In this official account of his treatment by the Germans, he says he was a political prisoner held by the Gestapo. In 1957, Trifa was granted U.S. citizenship. Trifa had strong ties to the Romanian Orthodox Church, and after coming to the United States, he was ordained a priest and quickly rose up through the church ranks. Trifa became Archbishop of the Diocese of Detroit and took the religious name Valerian. But soon, a cloud of suspicion and controversy surrounded Archbishop Trifa. Some of the Romanian immigrants in his church thought they recognized Trifa from their years in Romania. They said that a man named Trifa had been an ardent follower of Adolf Hitler during the war, and that Trifa was a leader of the Iron Guard, a pro-Nazi group in Romania.
The Iron Guard was the largest of the fascist movements in Romania. It was violent, it was anti-Semitic, it was the equivalent of the Nazi movement in Romania.
This picture shows an Iron Guard rally during the early years of World War II. The similarities to Nazism, the salute, the uniforms are clearly evident. And like the Nazis, the Iron Guard was also anti-Semitic. And like Hitler, the Iron Guard encouraged violence against the Jews and against others they perceived as enemies. Archbishop Trifa adamantly denied he had ever been a member of the Iron Guard. If the charge was true, it meant Trifa had lied to U.S. immigration officials. And it also meant that a high-profile religious leader in the United States was in fact a Nazi war criminal. Romanian immigrants living in the United States identified a high-ranking religious figure, Archbishop Valerian Trifa, as a Nazi war criminal from World War II. They believed that Archbishop Valerian Trifa had once been a member of Romania's Iron Guard, sympathetic to Adolf Hitler, and a group who encouraged violence against Romanian Jews. On January 20th, 1941, Viorel Trifa had broadcast a hate-filled radio address from the Romanian capital city of Bucharest. That radio address, encouraging violence against Jews, culminated in the roundup of thousands of Jews in Bucharest the next day. News accounts described the slaughter, known as a pogrom. Department of Justice prosecutor Eli Rosenbaum reads one of the news accounts.
Perhaps the most horrifying single episode of the pogrom was the quote-unquote kosher butchering last Wednesday night of more than 200 Jews in the municipal slaughterhouse. The Jews who had been rounded up after several hours of Iron Guard raids were put into several trucks and carried off to the slaughterhouse. There, the green shirts, he means the Iron Guardists, forced them to undress and led them to the chopping blocks, where they cut their throats in a horrible parody of the traditional Jewish methods of slaughtering fowl and livestock.
Romanian immigrants told U.S. authorities that Viorel Trifa was also the editor of the Iron Guard newspaper, Libertatea, which also called for violence against Jews.
Trifa's role, as far as the pogrom was concerned, was one of a propagandist, one of an advocate of anti-Semitic hatred, one of an inciter whose writings created an atmosphere in which this kind of violence not only became permissible and acceptable, but encouraged.
The U.S. government now faced a dilemma. Was there any way of finding out whether Archbishop Triffa was a past member of the Iron Guard. The only apparent evidence against Triffa was the decades-old memories of his fellow Romanian immigrants.
All of these cases were and are among the most challenging ones that anyone in law enforcement could ever imagine confronting. All of these cases involve crimes that took place long ago, decades earlier. It's difficult enough to prove a mugging that took place yesterday.
But one Romanian refugee, a New York dentist named Charles Kramer, refused to let the case die. Kramer's relatives were among the Jews killed at the hands of Romania's Iron Guard, and he vowed to bring Archbishop Triffa to justice. For 20 years, he petitioned the U.S. government to examine the case. In 1973, the Department of Justice officially opened an investigation into whether Archbishop Triffa had played a role in murdering Jews during World War II. U.S. prosecutors approached the West German government for assistance. The Germans kept meticulous records during the war, and in their archives, investigators found 22 postcards written by a man named Triffa, who had been a member of the Iron Guard.
The postcards were found in a record group in West Germany, not in the communist bloc, but in West Germany, in a record group that was called Small Collections. It was just small, miscellaneous collections that the German archivists did not know how to file. And so they filed them in a record group called Small Miscellaneous Collections.
Whoever wrote the postcards was no concentration camp survivor. The writer was a guest of the Nazi government and spent the war years in relative comfort.
They essentially describe what he's doing during the day, if he's seen a movie, what the weather's like. Very normal, mundane type of stuff that an individual at peace, without much fear of his life, might write to his comrades while on a vacation.
The cards were signed by VRL Triffa. If they were written by the man known in the United States as Archbishop Valerian Triffa, the Archbishop had lied to immigration officials. Forensic scientists looked for some way to prove that Archbishop Valerian Triffa had written these postcards. For decades, rumors circulated that Archbishop Valerian Triffa, a high-ranking religious figure in the Romanian Orthodox Church in the United States, was once a member of Romania's Iron Guard, a pro-Nazi group that encouraged the murder of hundreds of Jews during World War II. Archbishop Triffa denied he was a member. But when U.S. government officials found 22 postcards allegedly written by Triffa from Germany during the war, they asked document examiner Gideon Epstein to conduct a handwriting analysis.
No two people have ever been found to have the same handwriting. Not twins, not identical twins. Handwriting is composed of motor, muscular, and nervous movements of the body, all working together. And it becomes habitual and unique and individual almost from the point of time when people start to write.
Epstein spent months comparing signatures on the postcards with samples of Archbishop Triffa's known signatures, like this one from an official church document.
The whole forensic concept is that you're comparing something that's disputed against something that's known. And handwriting is basically the same thing. We have usually a document or a writing that's disputed, and then we have writings that are known. And the question is, did the person who made the known make the disputed?
Epstein noticed that the writings in all cases were done with extreme speed, or what is called fluency. So-called fluent writers have wide variations in how they write, and those variations are almost always the same, no matter how often they're repeated.
But to try to simulate or copy the style of a writer that has a great deal of variation, and to be able to simulate that variation at the same speed and the rhythm and fluency with all of the unconscious habits that the writer has. It's an impossibility.
After months of analysis, Gideon Epstein reached his conclusion. There was no doubt the writer of the German postcards was Valerian Triefer. This was proof that Triefer lied to immigration authorities, but he vowed to fight any deportation. Prosecutors were concerned. Their only solid evidence was the handwriting analysis and eyewitness identifications that were more than 30 years old. But looking at a blow-up photo of one of the postcards, investigators saw what they thought might be a clue. The card had only a return address, apparently just an update on where the writer was living. On a large blank space, investigators saw what they thought might be a fingerprint. They petitioned the West German government for the actual postcard and were denied. The West Germans did not want the postcard damaged, and in the 1970s, the powders used to detect fingerprints would have permanently altered the card. The case stalled for years.
I believe that the Immigration Service felt that the case was just too difficult. They couldn't handle it.
What brought the case back to life was a new piece of forensic technology, the laser. In the 1970s, researchers discovered that laser beams react with the oils that form fingerprints, causing the prints literally to glow or luminesce. The procedure was non-invasive. In other words, a print, if it existed, could be taken from the German postcard without damaging it. In 1982, the West Germans brought the postcard to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. to be examined with laser technology.
It was classified technology that enabled them, they believed, to detect fingerprints that could not be detected using traditional means. So sensitive was this technology, that is to say, so secret was it, that when a German official brought the postcard, the original, with a Justice Department escort to the FBI, the German official was allowed to go up to the door of the room in which the machine sat and no further. He was barred from even seeing it.
But there were a number of problems. Investigators were not even sure the postcard contained a print. And so much time had passed since the postcard was written, there were questions about whether the finger oils that might be present would be visible, even with laser technology. In 1982, the U.S. government's investigation of Valerian Triefer, the Romanian Archbishop of Detroit, was coming to a head. Prosecutors suspected that Triefer had lied about his involvement in the murder of hundreds of Jews during World War II. Triefer said they had the wrong man, that Triefer was a common name in Romania, and that it was another man named Triefer who had been the member of the pro-Nazi Iron Guard movement. The case came down to one postcard signed by Viorel Triefer in Germany during World War II. Forensic scientists suspected that it may contain a fingerprint. If a print was found and it matched Archbishop Valerian Triefer, there would be solid proof that he had lied about his past. Analyst Ron Kopacko put the card under a diffused laser beam. The laser light reacts with human finger oils to reveal prints. But in this case, the card was more than 40 years old, and there were questions about whether anything would be found. Kopacko, examining the card through orange-filtered goggles that eliminate all sources of light other than the laser, was surprised at what he saw. A clear print glowing on a blank area of the postcard. Despite the age of the postcard, it had absorbed enough finger oil to form a clear print. The question was whether the fingerprint on the postcard was the fingerprint of Archbishop Trifa. Capaco photographed the print on the postcard. In this photo, the print, a left thumb print, can be clearly identified. Investigators now went to the document Trifa entered the U.S. with in 1950. At that time, he was fingerprinted. The thumbprint of that document was compared with the thumbprint taken from the postcard. It was a perfect match. The prints on both documents were the left thumbprint of Valerian Trifa.
The ultimate proof is a latent fingerprint. There is no known way to fabricate a latent fingerprint in a way that is undetectable. So when we got word from the Bureau that their technology had succeeded in finding Trifa's print on this old document, something that had never happened in any of our cases before nor since, we were of course ecstatic. We were ecstatic.
This 40-year-old print is the oldest latent print ever detected by any law enforcement agency in the world. Investigators speculate that when Trifa wrote the card using the fountain pens of the day, his finger oils mixed with a small amount of ink, sealing the oils into the porous paper of the card. The ink faded over time, but the thumbprint remained intact. The print was almost invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible under the new technology of the laser.
Well, the postcard was a very important piece of evidence because not only were we able to identify his handwriting that he denied making, but also the thumbprint was identified as his. And there is no better form of personal identification than to have both the fingerprint and the handwriting of an individual identified on the same piece of evidence.
There was no way he could have known it, but the postcard he so casually sent in 1942 would seal his fate some 40 years later.
They went for the fingerprint to see if they could get it. Prosecutors always want to have the most proof available on hand.
When informed of the thumbprint match, Archbishop Trifa surrendered his citizenship. For Romanian refugees like Dr. Charles Kramer, who had lost relatives at the hands of Trifa's Iron Guard, the 40-year wait for justice was a long one.
I would have been much more satisfied if the trial went on continuously, exposed this murderer with all the crimes that he committed, and let the people at large know that a man that's changed the gun for the cross does not belong in the United States.
For 2 years, no other country was willing to accept Trifa. In 1984, Portugal agreed to take him in. After a youth spent as a fascist leader and adulthood spent as a religious figure hoping to escape his past, Valerian Trifa ended his days as an exile, dying in Portugal in 1987. Though decades had passed since Hitler and his henchmen terrorized Europe, the traces they left behind provided lasting evidence bearing witness to their crimes.
We don't have a murder weapon, we don't have a body. What we have is paper. It's paper that survives to bring these people to justice. Some with fingerprints, some without, really speak volumes about crimes that were committed by Trifa and by others. And it's those documents that survive. Even though the victims didn't survive, the documents survive to make these prosecutions possible.
When a popular high school teacher was found dead of a gunshot wound, investigators believed it was an accident.
This is January 29th.
But an audio tape recorded by the victim just 3 days before his death raised serious questions that required answers. Historic Durham, North Carolina is both a big city and a small town. Best known as the home of Duke University and its world-famous medical center. But it is also a close-knit southern community where families stay for generations.
Great place to raise a family. You look around for communities throughout the country that have wonderful school systems, great parks, great recreational facilities for children and families, and you'll find that here.
At Durham High School, Russell Steger was a popular baseball coach and driver's education teacher, a man respected by faculty and students alike. Jennifer Joyner was one of Russ Steger's students.
All the kids who needed advice or needed someone to talk with about their problems, Coach Steger, his door was always open, and he just meant a lot to the kids there.
After college, Russ Steger married his high school sweetheart, Jo Lynn.
Russ was a very gentle, compassionate, caring, full of life human being. He embraced life. He had a very tender heart.
Unfortunately, Steger wasn't as successful in his personal life as he was in his professional life. After 4 years of marriage, Russ and Jo Lynn divorced. Less than a year later, Russ married a 31-year-old widow, Barbara Ford. He adopted her 2 sons, Brian and Jason.
He took in Barbara's sons as his own. He loved them, he cared for them, and treated them like they were his own sons.
Barbara worked as a secretary at Duke University Medical Center. Russ continued to teach and coach. He worked weekends in the National Guard, and with his new wife, Barbara, taught Sunday school in their church. By all outward appearances, Russ and Barbara Steger lived a storybook life. But all that changed in the early morning hours of February 1st, 1988. Just as the night shift was ending, police got an emergency call of a shooting at the Steger home. Russ Steger was found sprawled on his bed with a bullet wound to the back of his head. He died 3 hours later in the hospital.
She kept making the comment, I kept telling him about those damn guns. I kept telling him about those damn guns.
Barbara Steger said that Russ slept with a .25 caliber pistol under his pillow because of some recent burglaries in the neighborhood. Just before dawn, Barbara said she was awakened when one of her sons went into the bathroom. Barbara was worried that Russ might mistake her son for a prowler, so she tried to remove the pistol from underneath Russ's pillow. When she did, the gun accidentally fired, shooting Russ in the back of the head. The death was ruled an accidental shooting.
He was a mentor, he was a baseball coach, he was a likable guy to so many children at a Durham High School. And they felt a sense of loss, they felt a sense of shock, they felt a sense of disbelief. What has happened to the guy that we loved?
When I first heard it, I couldn't believe it. I was like, no, not Coach Steger.
He was a great coach and everything. When I heard on the news, I felt sorry in my heart.
History had unfortunately repeated itself in a bizarre coincidence Barbara's first husband had died in a shooting accident too. He was cleaning his .25 caliber pistol when it accidentally went off, shooting himself in the chest. Barbara Steger was now a widow once more because of a shooting mishap. A few hours after Russ Steger's death, Detective Rick Buchanan went to the Steger home to ask some routine questions. When he got there, Barbara Steger's father was removing the bloody sheets, pillow, and bedspread. Since the death had been ruled accidental, the bedding was not considered evidence. It was Buchanan's first interview with Barbara Steger.
She was a little withdrawn, perhaps, but she was not overly friendly. She was not boo-hooing all the way through the interview.
Barbara Steger repeated her account of her husband's death, saying the gun went off accidentally as she pulled it from under her husband's pillow. She told Buchanan that her 9 years of marriage to Russ had been happy, that he was a great father to her 2 young boys.
Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't know exactly what it was, but it still wasn't enough to indicate anything other than an accidental shooting.
The news of Russ Steger's death was particularly troubling to his first wife, Jo Lynn.
My reaction was it was no accident, and that's what I said to my parents. And I remember my dad said, you can't know that it was no accident. You can suspect, but you can't know. And I said, no, I know that it was no accident.
Jo Lynn wrote a letter to police because Russ often confided in her. Russ told her that Barbara removed large sums of money from their bank account and that he suspected Barbara was having sexual affairs with other men. He had once caught her kissing another man in a parking lot. When investigators looked into Barbara Steger's background, they learned some surprising information about her first marriage.
Her first husband had died in bed and was killed at the business end of a .25 caliber pistol. And so now we have a lady who's had 2 husbands killed in bed with a .25 caliber gun, and on both occasions she was present.
Barbara's first husband, Larry Ford, had been cleaning his .25 caliber pistol when it accidentally discharged, shooting him in the chest. Although the death of Larry Ford had been ruled an accident, his family vigorously fought to have the case investigated as a possible murder. But the ruling was never changed. Barbara inherited Larry Ford's entire estate, and suspicions remained. Investigators now had another suspicious death and more questions about the same woman.
I desperately wanted to know that truth. I wanted a full-blown investigation. If it was accidental, I wanted that to be known. But if it was not accidental, as I so suspected, I wanted that to come out too.
90% of what we do is common sense, and then we apply the other 10% to law. And if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, by God, it's gonna be a duck.
Was it possible that Barbara Steger was not unlucky at all, but was in fact a serial killer? The death of Barbara Steger's first husband, Larry Ford, by an accidental self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest had officially been declared an accident, and after 10 years, the case had long been forgotten. But shortly before his death, it had clearly been on the mind of Russ Steger, Barbara's second husband. Russ Steger told his ex-wife Jo Lynn that he feared for his own life.
He also knew that her first husband had died under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and so when he put all of that together, I think he was a little concerned for his safety, but mostly he felt paranoid.
According to Barbara Steger, the gun under her husband's pillow had gone off accidentally as she tried to remove it. Barbara said the gun had a hair trigger and that she had barely touched it before it went off. Firearms expert Eugene Bishop performed what's known as a trigger pull test on the gun. Weights are attached to the trigger in 1 pound increments to measure the force required to pull the trigger. The gun had a 4 pound trigger pull, which is no hair trigger. Deliberate force would be required to fire the gun, a contradiction of Barbara Steger's story. In the autopsy, medical investigators discovered another discrepancy. The trajectory of the fatal bullet was not consistent with Barbara Steger's account. The bullet struck Russ Steger's head in a downward angle. Barbara claimed that the gun fired as she pulled it from under the pillow, which would have sent the bullet in an upward trajectory.
The angle of the trajectory would indicate that she was above and behind Russ when the shot was fired. So it was the autopsy was inconsistent with the story she was telling.
The spent shell casing was found just inches from the gun near Russ Steger's head. Eugene Bishop test-fired the pistol and found that it ejected shell casings to the right and rear of the shooter, which meant if Barbara's version was correct, the shell casing should have been found somewhere in the middle of the bed.
As far as the story concerned, was not what she was saying in her story did not coincide with my findings. Looking at the crime scene pictures of the cartridge case itself, where it was laying on the bed, it could not have been fired as she said it was fired.
When any firearm is discharged, dust, oil, and gunpowder are expelled from the barrel. If Barbara's version was correct, powder burns would have been present on the sheets. The sheets had been removed by Barbara's father immediately after the shooting and had been laundered. But powder residue can be identified, even after fabrics have been washed. When the sheets were examined, scientists found no evidence of gunpowder residue. With all of these contradictions, Detective Rick Buchanan asked Barbara Steger to demonstrate on videotape what happened on the morning of the accident.
Oh, I'm standing face to face with a killer. I know it, but she don't know I know it.
With the detective playing the part of Russ Steger, Barbara Steger recreates her version of the story.
And I don't know how it was in my hand. I have no idea if I touched it. I don't know. I don't know.
And almost immediately, she realizes there are inconsistencies.
Well, wait a minute. That wasn't quite on. Okay. And then I start getting up. Okay, that's how it was. I start getting up with it in my hand, but I don't know how I had it in my hand. Okay.
But she's repositioning the body in the bed with her, trying to make it fit her story, and she can't do it. She's a lying ass bitch. And that was probably vocalized as I watched the video and replayed it and replayed it and replayed it. There was no doubt at all that she intentionally shot and killed Russ Steger. No doubt whatsoever.
Police also doubted that Russ Steger, a member of the United States National Guard with weapons training, would have placed a loaded pistol under his pillow with the safety turned off and cocked with a round already in the chamber. This, along with Barbara Steger's videotape recreation, was enough to convince investigators that Russ Steger's death was no accident. But investigators were not prepared for the next clue in the case, a message from the victim himself.
This is Russ Steger. This is January 29, 1988, 10 minutes and 2.
Started to get up, to get it out from under there, heard the noise, shocked,
Evidence was mounting that Russ Steger's death was not the accident claimed by his wife Barbara. But if she had killed him in cold blood, as police suspected, they needed to find the motive. For that, they looked into the couple's financial records. Though the Stegers had a modest income, Russ was a school teacher, Barbara a secretary. Barbara was known for spending extravagantly, and the couple was deeply in debt.
We learned that Barbara had become involved in some debt, and this apparently was without Russ's knowledge. It appeared to be credit card debt, among other things.
Records of the Stegers' bank transactions were sent to forensic documents examiner Durwood Matheny. He compared Russ Steger's known signatures to signatures found on that second bank loan, as well as his will, which had been revised only months before his death.
They brought to me a will, they brought me some checks and other documents that were signed with the name Russell Steger, but that it was not his signature. On the will, I determined that it was a simulation of his signature, in other words, someone trying to make it look like his signature.
If Russ Steger hadn't signed these documents, who did?
There was actually forged checks where Russ Steger's account was being drawn upon and the money was being deposited in Barbara Steger's account. So all of the financial evidence tended to show that Barbara was in debt and Russ did not know about it.
The beneficiary of the forged life insurance policy with a payout of $170,000 was none other than his wife, Barbara Steger. The final piece of evidence in the case came from a most unlikely source. At Durham High School, one of Russ Steger's students was cleaning a gym locker when he came upon a cassette tape. The voice on the tape was one he recognized immediately.
This is Russ Steger. This is January 29th, 1988, 10 minutes and 2. She stood there to see.
The tape was recorded just 3 days before Russ Steger's death. On the tape, he confided his belief that his wife, Barbara, was planning to kill him.
The last few nights, Barbara has woken me up and gave me what she said was 2 aspirin. She stood there to see if I took it. I did not take it.
Russ Steger went on to question the allegedly accidental death of Barbara's first husband.
The first one, I don't know what happened, but according to his parents, there was some foul play going on. He supposedly accidentally shot himself in their bedroom. My question is, did her husband, Larry Ford, accidentally shoot himself? Sometimes I wonder.
Listening to that tape was surreal. I had never, ever experienced anything quite like that in prosecution, where you try a case, a person for homicide, and yet the victim, who you represent, who has no voice in the courtroom, is now telling you what he is feeling, experiencing, and worried about immediately prior to his execution, so to speak.
Investigators now had both evidence and motive. Barbara Steger was arrested on a charge of first-degree murder.
Here, these will help you sleep.
Prosecutors believe that Barbara Steger had been planning her husband's death for weeks. First with poison, and when that was unsuccessful, with a gun. Shortly before dawn, prosecutors believe that Barbara removed the .25 caliber handgun from its usual place in the dresser drawer, walked over to her sleeping husband, and fired into the back of his head. The bullet entered at a downward angle. She was also standing above the bed, which explains the lack of powder burns on the bedding. To stage the scene, Barbara placed the spent shell casing just inches from her husband's head, which was a mistake. If the gun went off as she pulled it from under the pillow, as she claimed, the shell casing would have ejected to the right, towards the foot of the bed. The angle of the bullet, the placement of the shell casing, the lack of powder burns, the forged will, and life insurance policy, and, most damning of all, Russ Steger predicting his own murder on audio tape made a compelling case to jurors.
Without the forensics of this case, there would have been nothing but theory and speculation. And you can't prosecute theory and speculation. You've got to have physical evidence. That's where the forensics came in.
Barbara Steger was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. Her sentence was later reduced to life in prison after an appeal.
I think those of us who cared so deeply for Russ ranted and raved and felt this was so unfair to take someone so special and so kind. And there's never an answer to why. There's never an answer to why evil wins sometimes.
Prosecutors also suspect that Barbara Steger was responsible for her first husband's death. But with her current life sentence, they see no need for further prosecution.
This case was a terrible tragedy. A good man, not just one but two, are gone. And they're gone forever because of the criminal conduct of Barbara Steger. And our court system worked. It uncovered the truth. A verdict was rendered and justice was done.
The date, July 28, 1996. The place, 60 feet beneath the English Channel off the coast of Devon, England. A fisherman was about to haul in his nets. His catch of the day would unearth a gruesome secret. Buried among the sea bass and crabs was a very large catch, a dead man with no apparent identification. The nets had disturbed a watery grave, revealing a mystery that would cross an ocean. When John Kopak, a fisherman of 30 years, pulled a dead body on board, he had a decision to make. A floater is a bad omen.
I can do one of two things here. I can pull this cod line and he goes back over the side and we go on fishing. Or we take him in which case the fish is going to be condemned. You're going to lose a day's wages.
Brixham Coast Guard, this is a fishing vessel, Mal Kerry. I've just hauled my gear 6 miles east of Teignmouth and I've got a body in the cod ends.
This is Brixham Coast Guard. Could you please stay at your position and we'll send somebody out?
The victim was an unidentified male between the ages of 40 and 50. From the amount of decomposition, the pathologist determined that the body had been in the water for less than a week. The victim was wearing a blue and white checkered shirt, leather belt, and green corduroy trousers with the pockets pulled inside out.
When I first examined the body, I noticed a tattoo on the back of the hand. I thought it was a cluster of stars, and that's what I said in my original report. And in any case, I've never seen a tattoo like that, not in British subjects.
There were several injuries noted on the body, bruises on his left hip and lower leg, and a 4-inch gash on the back of the head. Most likely the head injury caused unconsciousness, but the actual cause of death was never in question.
The lungs are the best organs to look for drowning, and the lungs showed evidence of drowning. So the cause of death was not difficult. But why he got into the water and why he drowned was the difficult part.
The only item of note on the victim was an expensive wristwatch. It was a Swiss-made Rolex brand Oyster Perpetual chronometer, which had stopped on the 22nd of the month. Every Rolex watch has a story.
Rolex keeps extraordinary records on their watches worldwide. Every Rolex watch comes with a serial number. It's hidden on the watch. But detailed records are kept for everyone who owns that watch forever, and all the servicing records.
The Rolex company identified the watch owner as Ronald J. Platt. The victim's next of kin were contacted. His brother positively identified Ronald Platt's body by the tattoo on his hand, a Canadian maple leaf. Ronald Platt was a 50-year-old television repairman who was divorced. He hadn't been in regular contact with his family, which is why he hadn't been reported missing. Platt had been living in Essex County, over 300 miles from Devon, where his body was discovered. On his application for his last apartment rental, he listed a man named David Davis as a reference.
I phoned David Davis up on his mobile phone number, and unfortunately, I told him about the fact that we'd recovered a body from the sea, which we believed to be his friend, Ronald Platt.
Davis told police that he and Ronald Platt had been friends, but that he hadn't seen Platt in over 3 months. David Davis was a 50-year-old retired financial advisor from Canada who was living in England with his 21-year-old wife, Noelle, and their 2 daughters. Davis and his family lived in the small village of Woodham Walter, in a cul-de-sac at the end of Little London Lane. When police went to interview Davis in person, they made the mistake of knocking on the wrong door.
The elderly gentleman replies, "No, no, no, this isn't Little London Farm. That," he says, pointing next door, "that is Little London Farm." So Redmond then asks, "Well, is that where David Davis lives?" And the elderly gentleman says, "No, no, no, that's not where David Davis lives. There's no David Davis there. That's where Ronald Platt lives. That's where Ronald Platt lives with his lovely wife and their 2 little children."
I couldn't believe what he was telling me, you know, it was bizarre. The guy that I had thought was dead and had been identified as dead to me was in fact live and well and living in Woodham Walter.
But why was David Davis now posing as Ronald Platt?
There was clearly something wrong here, and we had to put David Davis under the microscope, find out who he was, why was he using this false identity, was there something more sinister involved?
For reasons that were not at all clear, David Davis, a Canadian citizen living in England, had been posing as Ronald Platt, the name of the man found at the bottom of the English Channel. An investigation into Davis's background revealed some troubling information. For the last 3 years, all of Davis's bills were paid for with checks and credit cards signed by Ronald Platt, some signed after Platt's body was pulled from the sea. Davis met the real Ronald Platt through Platt's girlfriend, Elaine Boyes, who worked for David Davis in a small investment company Davis ran in London. Police also discovered that David Davis owned a sailboat that was moored in Devon, only a few miles from where Ronald Platt's body was discovered. Police searched through David Davis's mobile telephone records, which showed calls made from the same area where Platt's body was found. And the calls were made during the same time period in July that the medical examiner said Ronald Platt drowned. Davis claimed He hadn't seen his friend Ronald Platt in months, but police found witnesses who saw them together in the Devon area shortly before Platt's death.
He was clearly lying to us, as well as using Ronald Platt's identity, and that changed the complexion of things. So I contacted Essex and told them to change the charge that they were going to arrest him for, from check fraud to murder.
On Halloween morning in 1996, an armed English response team waited to arrest Davis at his home at the end of Little London Lane. A taxi unexpectedly drove down the lane in the middle of the police raid. Davis made a dash from the house to the taxi, which quickly took off to get past police.
Finally, the main police car catches up, pushes the taxi cab driver over to the shoulder. A policeman with a very big gun, drawn, moves out of the car, points it directly through the window at Davis's head.
David Davis was arrested on suspicion of the murder of Ronald Platt. In the house was Davis's 21-year-old wife, Noelle, and the couple's 2 little girls, 3-year-old Emily and Lillian, who was just 6 months old. Police allowed Noelle to pack a diaper bag with items for the children.
One of the officers there was a little suspicious, however, about its weight, and searched the bag, and inside found that she'd slipped inside the baby clothes £4,000 in cash and 5 gold bars.
At police headquarters, Noelle's purse contained a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, documents in the name of Ronald Platt and Platt's girlfriend, Elaine Boyes, and the children's birth certificates, which listed Ronald Platt and Elaine Boyes as the parents.
She gave no real explanation for that, other than to say that when she'd got pregnant, she needed medical attention, and had actually used Elaine Boyes' identity cards to get that medical treatment.
The police are mystified by the gap in ages. In fact, it seems like about a 30-year gap. She barely looks 20. He looks to be about 50. What's going on? They decide that they're going to bear down on her in questioning, see if they can make her crack, and in fact they do, and they find out something that surprises even them, namely, she blurts out, "He's my father."
Noelle refused to identify the father of the children. David Davis's home on Little London Lane held a wealth of evidence. Envelopes stuffed with Swiss francs, British pounds, American dollars, keys to storage lockers, gold bars, expensive paintings, and in a mountain of documents, a tiny scrap of paper that would be a turning point in the investigation.
And they found a receipt with 7 items listed on it, bought from a shop called Sport Nautique in Dartmouth on the water. And in those 7 items, there was something that was noted. It was a 10-pound plow anchor.
Police went back to question John Kopak, the fisherman who pulled Platt's body out of the sea in his nets.
Didn't notice the anchor till we actually physically got the gear on board, till we got the trawl on board. And I didn't connect the 2 together until the following day.
The 10-pound zinc galvanized plow anchor found in the fishing nets with Ronald Platt's body may have been used to anchor Platt's body at the bottom of the English Channel and came loose when he was dragged to the surface by fishing nets. When Dr. Fernando laid the anchor next to the injuries on Platt's leg, he discovered the cause of the wounds.
The bruise on the hip was caused by the lower end of the anchor, and the bruise on the thigh was caused by the other end of the anchor. So the anchor had been hooked to his waistband or to his belt.
It was becoming evident how Ron Platt died. The anchor and Platt's belt were sent to the forensics lab for analysis. On Platt's leather belt was a translucent deposit. Police asked a forensic metallurgist to determine what made the mark.
I worked with a sample from the belt in the area of the mark and a sample from the surface of the anchor.
The mark on Platt's belt was analyzed with a scanning electron microscope, and the material on the belt was identified.
Basically, the mark on the belt was predominantly zinc, as was the surface of the anchor.
Still unanswered was how Ron Platt's body got 6 miles out into the English Channel. Dr. Bob Allen, a hydraulic engineer, analyzed the location of the body and studied the water currents during the week Platt was in the English Channel.
They told me where the body was recovered, and what they were concerned about was where the body had entered the water. We determined what the currents were in the area, but what we weren't able to say was whether those currents were strong enough to move the body without some further work.
Dr. Allen conducted a unique experiment to simulate a drowned man anchored to the bottom of the English Channel. He attached a 10-pound anchor to his belt, expelled the air from his lungs, and sank to the bottom of an artificial channel, which recreated the cold seawater and the same currents that were present when Platt's body was dumped. The anchor held the body firm, meaning it was dumped in the same location where it was found.
And we knew then that the body had not moved anywhere, that it was found where it was dumped.
Davis's sailboat, the Lady Jane, was brought into the forensics lab for an inspection. Inside the cabin, a small hair sample was discovered on the seat cushion, and there was a plastic sport nautique bag from the same store where Davis purchased the anchor. Both were sent for forensic testing. To fingerprint smooth, non-porous material like the sport nautique bag, forensic experts put the bag in a sealed cabinet. Inside, super glue is heated and the fumes adhere to the finger oils on the bag, which can be visualized when the bag is dipped in a yellow fluorescent dye which adheres to finger oils. The fingerprint on the sport nautique bag was that of Ronald Platt. DNA testing of the hair found on the boat cushion revealed the hair was also that of Ronald Platt. Finally, police examined the ship's navigational device called a GPS, Global Positioning System, which records signals from 3 satellites triangulating the boat's position on the Earth. A GPS stores the time and location of the boat when it is last turned off. The GPS from Davis's boat indicated that he shut off the navigational device just 3.8 nautical miles from the spot where the body resurfaced. The date was July 20th. The Rolex watch found on Ronald Platt was self-winding, which means it runs for 40 hours after it stops moving. The watch stopped on July 22nd. 40 hours earlier made the date July 20th, the same date recorded by the GPS on the Lady Jane. Police knew that David Davis wasn't this man's real name, but just who was he? A man living with his daughter as husband and wife, with 2 small children, whose paternity was unclear. And what was his motive to murder Ronald Platt? A retired businessman, David Davis was a suspect in the murder of his friend Ronald Platt, but investigators wanted to know his true identity. When they compared Davis's fingerprints to those of wanted fugitives from around the world, the prints matched a man who had been on the run for 6 years.
We had a hit. David Davis came back, identified in Canada as being their most wanted man, called Albert Johnson Walker. So this was the first time that we actually know who this guy was.
Albert J. Walker, from Ontario, Canada, had been married for 22 years and had 4 children. He became one of the 10 most wanted criminals in the world after embezzling over $4 million from investors in Canada.
He was on the verge of being caught So he decided to flee Canada, and he took his 15-year-old daughter, Sheena, with him and disappeared completely, or almost.
Walker and his daughter Sheena lived together in England as David and Noelle Davis, man and wife.
One of the Canadian police decided to phone Walker's wife, Barbara. And it was very simple, very straightforward. We found Albert and we found your daughter Sheena. And by the way, congratulations, your grandmother.
When Walker fled to England, he began working the same investment scams as he did in Canada and hired Elaine Boyes as an executive assistant. When Walker no longer needed Elaine Boyes' services, he paid for Elaine and her boyfriend, Ronald Platt, to move to Canada to start a new life together. With Platt gone, Walker assumed his identity. But 3 years later, Elaine Boyes and Ronald Platt returned to England, which threatened Walker's plans.
There now were 2 Ronald Platts, and that was one too many. For Albert Walker, he had to get rid of his friend.
Albert Walker put his plan into motion when he purchased a new 10-pound anchor, not for his sailboat, but for Ronald Platt. On July 20th, 1996, Walker invited Platt out on the Lady Jane for a day of sailing. With a blunt instrument, Walker knocked Platt unconscious with a blow to the back of his head. Blood and hair spattered onto the plastic bag. Walker then pulled Platt to the upper deck, where he slid the anchor under Platt's belt and heaved him overboard. Among the mistakes Walker made that day was failing to remove Platt's wristwatch with the serial number and using his boat's global positioning system, which captured the location, date, and time of the murder. Albert Walker went on trial for murder. In a rare courtroom occurrence, Walker's daughter testified against her own father.
At a stage in the trial, it came out in the courtroom that obviously Mr. Walker and Sheena were father and daughter, and yet 2 children were found on the premises when the police made their raid. Well, the jury was just struck dumb.
On July 6, 1998, it took the jury just 2 hours to find Albert Walker guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.
He made one big mistake, and that was that he forgot to take off that Rolex watch. And it was really that Rolex watch that led us to the identity of Ronald Platt and started the whole chain of events, which ended up with Walker getting a life sentence for murder.
Sheena Walker is now living quietly with her children in Canada. She would not agree to a paternity test on her 2 little girls.
I think Mr. Walker is, without a doubt, probably the most fascinating character I've ever come across. He was a consummate actor. Even as we speak, this man is still plotting his way out of prison. And I think it's chilling, really.
Ronald Platt, the victim, is often forgotten. It was Ronald Platt, the 1 in a million shot of him actually returning from his watery grave 6 miles out at sea when he was caught in those nets. The injuries on his body showing us exactly how he was killed and how the anchor was used to weigh him down. The piece of paper he wrote out for his reference where he put David Davis, the name of his killer, and his cell phone number, which led us to Davis. Everything really came from Ronald Platt. His head hair that was found on the boat, his fingerprints on the plastic bag. He was showing us that he'd been in that boat and that boat had been used to murder him. It was really Ronald Platt who solved this case, and when he emerged from his watery grave, pointed his tattooed hand directly at his murderer, Albert Johnson Walker.
Cincinnati heart surgeon Dr. Darrell Sartorius had a second chance at love when he married a pretty young divorcee. But happiness is sometimes elusive. Dr. Sartorius fell into a serious depression and apparently committed suicide with a .38 caliber pistol. But why did he fire a test shot into the sofa cushion before killing himself? Cincinnati, Ohio, the 6th largest city in the United States. Because of its size and sophistication, its healthcare facilities are among the finest anywhere. Dr. Darrell Sartorius was one of the city's most successful and respected heart surgeons, but he was also impatient and demanding.
Dr. Sartorius was a very busy surgeon, but he didn't have the strongest people skills. He was perceived by many of his coworkers as very gruff, angry, kind of difficult to please sort of man.
Dr. Sartorius met his wife Janet, who was a nurse at the same hospital. The couple had 4 children together, 3 daughters and a son. And it wasn't long before Janet realized the many challenges of being married to a busy doctor.
He was in a solo practice, which took up all of his time. He was on call all of the time. He chose to do that, and he was doing very well, but it wasn't easy, and he was always worried that his last referral would be his last referral.
The hard work and sacrifice paid off. By the mid-1980s, Dr. Sartorius was earning $300,000 a year. But the climb to the top of his profession came with a price. The marriage was strained due to long hours, pressure, and Darrell's explosive temper.
He was almost dangerous. He could put you down. He could make you feel really bad about yourself. And he would do it. And sometimes to the children, he liked to be in control, and he liked to be in charge, and he liked to be a provider and a caretaker. And while we enjoyed some of that, we weren't totally wanting to be controlled or taken care of, and that bothered him. I think I was a little too independent for him.
After 30 years of marriage, the couple divorced. Dr. Sartorius was lonely, depressed, and overweight, and had a difficult time living apart from his children.
He was interested in finding a woman, I think, who didn't challenge him much, who would tell him how wonderful he was and stroke his ego, so to speak.
For companionship, Sartorius turned to a dating service. Dating services are a big business in the United States. For a fee, clients provide their picture and personal information, which the service distributes to other clients. The dating service thought Dr. Sartorius and 45-year-old Dante Britton would make a good match. Ms. Britton described herself as the owner of a daycare facility who had recently been divorced.
She was cute, perfect size 2, very petite. She was able to give off the air of, I am a catch, which is very important to a mate, somebody looking for a mate.
After 4 months of dating, Dr. Sartorius and Dante were married. It looked as if Darrell was moving on with his life, but soon his new wife noticed problems.
He was very nice and very kind, but he was so depressed.
And along with depression, Dante discovered that Darrell was impotent.
He was embarrassed to tell me, and he wasn't, I guess, quite sure how I'd take it. And I just told him, just keep giving me lots of hugs and lots of kisses on the cheek, and know, just keep holding my hand.
Dr. Sartorius was so depressed that he spoke of committing suicide to some of his colleagues. Part of the problem were some startling secrets he found out about his new wife. After Dr. Sartorius married Dante Britton, the couple moved into a luxurious home in an upscale Cincinnati suburb. Dante relished the lifestyle that her husband's income could provide.
She finally had her wish, you know. She had fur coats made, she had Jaguars, she had Lexus, she had all the things she wanted. She went to spas, she went to the Caribbean, she went on holidays. Really, that's what she seemed to always want, was that perfect lifestyle.
But from the start, the marriage was in trouble. Dr. Sartorius was suffering from depression, impotence, and the couple fought often about money and who controlled the purse strings.
Oh, Deborah, I am so happy for you. Wherever you want the wedding reception is fine. Don't worry about the cost, I'll take care of it.
There had been a terrible argument when Dante learned Daryl was going to pay for his daughter's wedding.
You spend far too much money on your kids the way it is. And I'm sick of it. This is ridiculous.
Dante resented spending money on Daryl's children.
If he were to buy something for the children, she would retaliate by going out and buying designer clothes, furs, jewelry, running up the credit card bill, basically in retaliation for him paying attention to his own children.
Dante's behavior prompted Sartorius to look into his wife's background. He found out that much of what Dante had told him were lies. Her real name was Della Hall. She never graduated from UCLA as she had claimed. In fact, she hadn't finished high school. And she had lied about how many times she had been married.
Dr. Sartorius was Della's 5th husband. She was the type of person who had to have the last word, who would often go out of a relationship with a bang, so to speak.
And Sartorius discovered his new wife had a long history of violence.
She threatened husband number 4 with a gun. She threatened husband number 3 with a knife. One guy, the common law husband, she actually lit his bed on fire, drugged him and lit his bed on fire. He woke up in a burning bed. He lived through it. Thank God.
There were rumors that she had murdered previous boyfriends and possibly another husband out in California. We spent quite a bit of time working with the Los Angeles Homicide Squad, who were very cooperative and tracked down several leads for us, but we're never able to identify a previous boyfriend or husband in Southern California that was not currently alive.
Mrs. Sartorius had also been convicted of threatening an earlier husband with a gun, an incident that terrified Daryl.
I spoke to one of his colleagues, another heart surgeon in Cincinnati, about this, and he said Daryl came into work one day wearing a bulletproof vest, and this other surgeon could not believe it. He said, "You know, what are you talking about?" And Daryl said, "Well, you know, I'm fearful for my life, and I'm wearing a bulletproof vest." I mean, he admitted to it.
Officer, I need your help.
After learning the truth about his new wife, Dr. Sartorius stopped a local policeman at a gas station. He handed the policeman a handgun belonging to his wife and asked him to take it because he feared for his life. The policeman noted that Dr. Sartorius seemed disoriented. Dr. Sartorius' next stop was his lawyer's office. Although the marriage was only 10 months old, Sartorius wanted his wife cut out of his will. He also began divorce proceedings. By this time, the couple no longer slept together. He spent most of his time in the basement, and days would go by without the two of them seeing one another. On Monday morning, February 19, 1996, Dr. Sartorius didn't show up for work and didn't answer his pages. His nurse called 911.
911 emergency dispatcher, woman.
I work for Daryl Sartorius, and he is a doctor, and I've been paging him. I'm afraid something has happened to him, because this isn't like him not to answer a page.
When police arrived at the Sartorius home, Mrs. Sartorius said she didn't know where her husband was. Police asked to search the home. Dr. Sartorius's car was in the garage. In the basement, they found Dr. Sartorius dead of a gunshot wound to the head. A .38 caliber pistol was on the floor.
It had the appearances of a suicide. It was a gunshot wound to the side of the head. The gun was relatively close to the body.
The blood was completely dry, and rigor mortis had set in, an indication that he had been dead for at least a day or two. It appeared that Sartorius had been drinking and watching television when he fired the fatal shot.
Well, I knew that he was certainly suicidal, and his lawyer thought that he was suicidal and that there had been a chance that it had been suicide.
The .38 caliber pistol used in Dr. Sartorius's death was registered to Mrs. Sartorius, who had picked it up from this store just 24 hours before he was killed. First impressions indicated that Dr. Sartorius's death was suicide. He was depressed on antidepressant medication, and he told friends he was considering suicide. Mrs. Sartorius said she didn't hear any gunshots from the basement, but the next-door neighbors heard a loud bang from the Sartorius home sometime after midnight on Saturday. When forensic experts arrived at the scene, they immediately saw other inconsistencies. 2 shots had been fired, one into the sofa cushion, the other to the head.
It is not uncommon at all for the person who is going to use this firearm to take their own life to test fire the weapon first, to make sure they know how to use the weapon.
The bullet entered just above the right ear, and there was no exit wound. Blood was expelled from Sartorius's mouth and nose, but there was blood spatter on Dr. Sartorius's left arm, as well as both sides of his right hand. It appeared that Sartorius's right arm was in his lap at the time of the fatal shot, and not behind his head holding the gun. Proof of this was blood found on Dr. Sartorius's right palm. If Dr. Sartorius shot himself, the handle of the gun would have prevented blood spatter from hitting his palm when the shot was fired.
The bloodstains that are present on the palmar surface of the right hand of Dr. Sartorius represent the exhalation of blood after injury. And these are distributed over quite a wide area, but it also indicates that the hand, that is the right hand, was very close to the face. And it indicates to me that the hand was moved after the exhalation of blood occurred.
You've got the problem. If Daryl Sartorius fired the fatal shot at himself, his hand would have been back here at the time and not in a position to receive the blood spatter.
Another discrepancy: blood on the front of the sofa in front of the body.
This blood couldn't have come from him and been hitting the front of the couch at, let's say, a 40-degree angle, that this had to have been like flung off of somebody's hands.
Finally, there was the second bullet fired at the scene. It was possible that Dr. Sartorius had test-fired the weapon before firing the fatal shot into his head. But the powder burns on Dr. Sartorius's right hand and on the sofa were on top of the blood, which meant the blood was there first, before the second shot was fired.
Dr. Sartorius most likely would not have been able to fire that shot himself. It was done by someone else. It is most logical that the hand was moved to an area where the second shot was fired in an attempt to produce perhaps gunshot residue on the hands of the victim, which would then, in the mind of the shooter, make this appear more like a suicide than a homicide.
Mrs. Sartorius was the only other person in the house when Darrell died. But what was her motive for murder?
She had a $1 million motive. She wanted that money. He had a pension plan that she was entitled to as his wife.
If Darrell had divorced her, Mrs. Sartorius would have only received an allowance of between $1,000 and $2,000 a month. $1 million is a powerful motive for murder. But perhaps the most damaging piece of information was what Della's mother told police.
Della's mom gets on the phone, calls the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, and assures them that Darrell Sartorius did not commit suicide. Assures them that he was murdered, and guarantees them her daughter is the one that committed the offense.
Della Faye Hall, also known as Dante Britton, was arrested and charged with murder in the shooting death of her husband, Darrell Sartorius. Her defense suggested a killer was loose in the neighborhood, since a neighbor was brutally murdered a few blocks away 3 days after Sartorius's death. But there were no signs of forced entry in the Sartorius home, and prosecutors were convinced that the forensic evidence and motive clearly pointed to Mrs. Sartorius. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Sartorius was on the sofa in the basement watching television. His wife approached from behind with her .38 caliber pistol. She fired a fatal shot. Blood from his nose and mouth spattered over his right palm, evidence that he was not holding the gun when it was fired. Della then placed the gun in his hand and fired the second shot to make sure gunpowder residue would be found on his hands. But the blood on his palm showed otherwise, as did the powder burns on the sofa cushions, which were also on top of the blood stains. During the murder, blood got onto Della's hand, which he tried to shake off. The blood hit the sofa from the front at a 45-degree angle.
But in moving Dr. Sartorius's hand and in moving and putting the gun into it, she committed some very fatal flaws to her defense that this was a suicide. You now have blood. She got blood on her hands and kind of flung it back. So now you've got blood spatter on the couch coming from the wrong direction. And it's down below where his legs would have been. And there was no scientific way to explain that from a suicide position. So she's got that problem. She's got blood going the wrong direction on the couch. She's got an arm where it shouldn't be. She's got blood on both sides of his hands where it shouldn't be. And she's got smeared blood on a firearm where it shouldn't be.
Although Dr. Sartorius's death may have appeared to be suicide, the forensic evidence clearly pointed to murder. During the trial, the voice of Dr. Sartorius himself was heard in the courtroom, a message to his daughter left on her answering machine.
Don't call Dante. Don't talk to Dante. If you like her, just keep it between the two of us. Please. I think that would prove it.
You could hear the fear in his voice that, you know, she's threatening to kill me. I'm afraid she's going to follow through on this. You know, I may not live through this. Please don't push this right now.
A Cincinnati jury deliberated for just over 4 hours before delivering a verdict.
We, the jury, and the issue joined, find the defendant, Della Dante Sartorius, guilty of aggravated murder.
She was sentenced to life in prison and won't be eligible for parole until 2014.
Well, you know, would I have preferred to see Della get the death penalty? Yes, I would have. I think that what she did was terrible.
There was really an overwhelming amount of blood evidence here to indicate that this was a staged scene. And to this day, I don't know what Della was thinking that she was going to be able to get away with, because the evidence, there was just too much evidence there.
Her own mother calls her a black widow spider. Her own mother characterizes her as a fortune hunter who found her way to success by latching on to a successful man.
Noted crime writer Aphrodite Jones interviewed Della in prison for her best-selling book, Della's Web. Jones believes that when Della heard about her husband's divorce plans, Della concluded that murder was her only alternative.
Absolutely, Della is a born killer. She is a born sociopath. She is somebody who views the world through her eyes only, which doesn't add up with the reality, the consensus of reality in the rest of the world. In her eyes, the world is her oyster for the taking. And if she can't take it, she'll find a way to take it. There is no earning anything, there is no justification for anything. It's just all about her.
The Sartorius family cannot easily forget the years stolen from them through a senseless, irrational act of betrayal.
He has wonderful children who are very accomplished and educated, and he would be very proud of them. He now has 2 son-in-laws and 2 grandchildren whom I think he would have adored, would have loved to have spent time with, and I think he would have come into his own in this part of his life, where he had accomplished what he had set out to do, and he could sit back and enjoy his accomplishments, certainly with his children. And I'm very sad that he was not allowed to enjoy that, and I miss him. We all miss him a lot.
Just after dark on a warm summer evening, 5 children were walking home along this road.
I just want to walk with us.
Suddenly, out of nowhere, a pickup truck headed towards them. 3 of the children were hit. 1 was killed. The driver sped away. Investigators called on state-of-the-art science to reconstruct the crime in hopes of learning how the accident happened and the identity of the driver. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, is one of America's most popular resort towns. The beach and sunny weather bring in almost 7 million tourists each year. And the city is also home to 1.5 million full-time residents. The Walker family settled into this working-class neighborhood, one they believed was safe from crime and violence. The Walkers' youngest child, 6-year-old Nicole, loved the neighborhood because of the large number of children who all played together.
She didn't like to smile. She used to tell people, I don't know how to smile. You tickle her and say, see, you could smile and always be a cockeyed smile. Her glasses would always be cockeyed, so I used to call her my kooky cockeyed little one.
Just after dark, on June 23, 1992, Nicole Walker was walking home with 4 other neighborhood children. It was just after a rainstorm, and they were walking along the side of this road where there are no sidewalks. When they got to the front of this apartment building, there was a large puddle of water left from the rainstorm. Michelle and Gina Vitello were walking with Nicole that night. They were 10 years old at the time.
I'm walking in the street,
and there's a big puddle, so we wanted to go through it so that we don't have to be in the street. And Nicole didn't want to walk through it because she didn't want to get sick because she had no shoes on. So Michelle picked her up, and we started walking through the puddle.
As we were walking in this puddle, I had Nicole in my hands. Everybody was telling me to watch out, and that was about all I remember.
And I see this car, this a bunch of lights, just coming straight at us, and I just yell, "Watch out."
By the time they saw the vehicle, it was too late. Nicole Walker and Michelle Vitello were both hit.
I went over to check on Nicole, and I seen blood coming out of her mouth and her ears, and I knew she wasn't gonna make it.
One of the kids ran to Nicole's home.
There was the knock at the door, and it was Joel. There was no color in his face, and his eyes were so bugged out of his head. He was just, you could see the terror, the fright, just saying the girls were all hit. The girls were all hit.
The children were rushed to the hospital. Michelle suffered a broken leg, 2 broken wrists, and a lacerated liver. 9-year-old Brooke Mancy suffered a fractured shoulder and facial injuries that required a dozen stitches. 6-year-old Nicole died shortly after arriving at the hospital.
Some internal surgeons came in, and the conclusion was, no, she doesn't have a chance. And I begged and pleaded even for a 1% chance, and they told me, no, there's no chance.
Nicole died of severe trauma to the head and massive internal injuries. A witness said it was a man driving a green pickup truck with a white camper top which sped away quickly, ran this red light, and disappeared.
I was just wondering how can somebody like just hit people and just keep going without even caring like what was gonna happen to them, and just left us to die. And it's just this scary feeling. I didn't know if they were ever gonna find him or what.
Investigators were hoping that science could identify the pickup truck and the driver.
How could you hit 5 little kids and keep on going?
Suzanne Walker was grief-stricken and angry over the death of her daughter, Nicole.
How could you do that? How could anybody hit kids and keep on going? Just to know you laid them flat out in the middle of a road, and you had to know.
Detective Bruce Babcock, a member of an elite team of accident reconstructionists, was called to the scene. Just before the accident, witnesses said a green truck swerved off the road, knocking over some trash cans, then stopped in a nearby cul-de-sac. A few minutes later, the truck started up again, heading back out of the neighborhood on the same road on Southwest 33rd Avenue. As it approached the apartment building, it veered off the road into the puddle, hitting 3 of the 5 children, killing 6-year-old Nicole Walker. Witnesses said the truck picked up speed after fleeing the accident. Bruce Babcock took detailed measurements of the accident scene and photographs.
When we got to the scene, the grill piece had been found in the puddle by a citizen who later gave it to one of the initially responding deputies. There was also a piece of clothing that from Nicole that we found in the puddle itself.
The grill was unique. It had come from a special edition 1980 Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck. Babcock also found pieces of plastic from the front turn signal lens of the truck. Forensic chemist Bruce Ayala hoped that Nicole's clothing would contain vital evidence.
The first area of interest in my analysis was to examine the victim's clothing, because many times in hit-and-run accidents where pedestrians are involved, there's paint transferred from the front end of the vehicle to the victim's clothing.
Ayala did find paint on Nicole's clothing under a microscope. he discovered that the chips actually contained 6 different layers of paint, but the outer layer of paint was blue and not green, as the witnesses had indicated. The grill left at the scene matched the pattern injury on the back of 6-year-old Nicole Walker. And the head injury on the back of her head indicated that Nicole's head most likely hit the hood portion of the truck. Investigators now changed the description of the truck and notified the public to be on the lookout for a blue 1980 Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck with possible front-end damage.
And in essence, there was a manhunt in an attempt to look for this vehicle, because the investigators knew that if they found this vehicle, there was a great likelihood that they would be able to determine who was the driver of this truck and responsible for Nicole's death.
On this street,
news reports of the hit-and-run accident outraged the community. Detectives searched all over Florida for the blue Silverado pickup truck. 3 weeks went by. Then an anonymous caller told police that a blue Silverado pickup truck was in a driveway about 20 miles from the accident scene.
This deputy arrived at the home, got out of his vehicle, and noticed as he was walking towards the front door that there was a truck, a blue Silverado pickup truck, that was surrounded by other vehicles.
A washing machine had been placed in front of the truck, obscuring its front end. The truck did not have the white camper top witnesses described. The front grille was intact, although it was not the original one, and the front turn signal lens was broken. In addition, the tires did not match tire impressions from the accident scene. The truck was registered to a Catherine Pierce, whose husband, 52-year-old Ken Pierce, had a prior history of driving while under the influence of alcohol. One of the victims thought the driver was a man, but couldn't identify Ken Pierce as the driver of the vehicle.
The truck was just speeding at us. All I can remember is a bright light, just bright lights coming straight at us.
I was so confused about the whole thing. Just not even remember getting hit or nothing. It's just weird thing.
Investigators faced 2 difficult tasks. First, trying to prove that this was the truck involved in the accident, and second, to figure out who was driving the truck.
The problem for us was developing the evidence that was going to be needed to show who, in fact, was the driver of this truck, who veered off that roadway and hit Nicole Ray Walker that night and veered back on and didn't stop. That was going to be the challenge.
It was now 3 weeks after the hit-and-run death of Nicole Ray Walker, and police had the truck they believed was involved in the accident. But there were problems with making a definitive match. If this was the truck in the accident, it had been altered some time after the accident with different tires, repairs to the front grille, and the truck did not have the white camper top witnesses clearly recalled seeing. There were no fingerprints inside the compartment of the truck, which was extremely unusual. It appeared that the inside compartment had been wiped clean. District Attorney Ken Padowitz kept a picture of Nicole Walker on his desk, a sign of his determination to find out what exactly happened on the night of the accident. So he turned to a new state-of-the-art scientific tool, forensic animation, which can create a virtual rendering of an accident.
The best way to understand the concept of forensic animation or reconstruction would be to understand that what we're trying to do is visualize the opinions of other experts.
All of the information gathered at the crash site by accident reconstructionist Bruce Babcock was taken into account. The horizontal and vertical measurements of 2,000 feet of roadway, the eyewitness accounts, the weather conditions, and the injuries sustained by the victims. The mechanical specifications of the 1980 Chevrolet Silverado were also programmed into the computer. They also calculated the approximate tire pressure, and the height and weight of their suspect, Ken Pierce, who was 5 foot 11 inches tall and 210 pounds. All would affect the height of the truck as it traveled down the street before striking the children. The speed was uncertain, so they estimated the truck was traveling 30 miles per hour, the posted speed limit on that road. Michelle Vitello was carrying 6-year-old Nicole Walker on her right hip at the time of impact. When the animators programmed this information, they made a startling discovery. The front grille of Kenneth Pierce's truck would have struck Nicole Walker in the back at the exact same place and at the same 22-degree angle reported by the forensic pathologist at Nicole's autopsy.
We then took an angle of Nicole's spine to the vertical, the height of Nicole from the roadway or the ground, and suddenly it was at that point we discovered that we could match these bruising marks and contusions to actual elements on the front of the truck. A real revelation to us, and certainly something that could become very crucial in the case.
When the animation was complete, it consisted of 3 different views. An overhead perspective, providing a bird's eye view of what happened. Another from inside the vehicle, which would have been the view of the alleged driver, Kenneth Pierce. From this vantage point, you can see that Nicole's head would have hit the front hood of the truck, causing her fatal head injury. The third view, a so-called chase view, was from behind the truck. For further proof, investigators turned to the paint chip found on Nicole's shirt at the time of the accident. The paint chip was blue, but there were 5 other layers of paint underneath. Forensic chemist Bruce Ayala ground the paint sample in a pestle, then analyzed it using infrared spectroscopy, which uses infrared light to identify the chemical makeup. The results were charted onto a computer graph.
They were 6 different layers of paint. There was blue metallic present, blue non-metallic, gray body filler, then there was a blue metallic factory paint, a white factory primer, and a black factory primer. Subsequently, when we examined the suspect's vehicle, we found that all 6 of those layers were present on his vehicle.
And finally, the plastic particles found at the crime scene were the same in color and materials as the broken turn signal on Pierce's truck. Although there were no fingerprints found in the compartment of the truck, Kenneth Pierce's partial thumbprint was found on a can on the floor of the vehicle. 52-year-old Kenneth Pierce was arrested and charged with vehicular homicide in the death of Nicole Walker.
I don't want to walk.
The forensic animation showed clearly that the driver would have known he had hit the children at the time of the accident. Before the trial, Ken Pierce's neighbor, Terry Jones, came forward and told police that Pierce admitted driving the truck on the night of the accident.
Mr. Jones told us that Ken Pierce had contacted him and requested that he come over and help fix the damage to the front of the vehicle. He also received a camper top that had been taken off the vehicle. The camper top was worth about $500, and Mr. Pierce gave it to him for the work that he did on the car.
Kenneth Pierce had a number of prior arrests and convictions.
It should be somewhat significant to find out that in addition to 20 arrests and convictions for felonies and misdemeanors in Mr. Pierce's life, he had 2 prior hit-and-run convictions.
At the trial, prosecutors wanted to introduce the forensic animation to show the jury their version of what happened on the night of the accident. Defense lawyers claimed that the animation was nothing more than speculation and would prejudice the jury. Prosecutors said the animation was a factual account of the accident. The judge ruled that the forensic animation was admissible. It showed that the blue Silverado truck traveling north on 33rd Avenue drove off the road and struck some trash cans. After the vehicle stopped briefly in the cul-de-sac, it then turned around and headed south on 33rd Avenue. As it approached the intersection of Griffin Avenue in front of the apartment building, the truck veered off the road into the puddle and hit the children. The front grille of the truck struck 6-year-old Nicole Walker in the back at a 22-degree angle, leaving this deep bruise at the moment of impact. The truck made a right turn onto Griffin Avenue and sped off. The computer animation, constructed exactly to scale, shows that it was a truck the same height as the Chevrolet Silverado that was involved in the accident.
There was no reason for him not to have known that it was in fact children that he struck. In fact, witnesses said that he accelerated from the scene as he fled.
Every single one of those jurors had their eyes glued to that television screen. And I can say, as I studied them and watched them view that computer animation, that I had every single moment of their attention captured for that brief period of time.
At the moment of impact, paint chips were also deposited on Nicole's clothing. Paint chips which were later matched to Mr. Pierce's truck.
And about front-end damage to a 1980 Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck. He hired Terry Jones. He hired Terry Jones to fix the front of that truck.
In addition to the scientific evidence, jurors heard testimony that Ken Pierce made efforts to conceal damage to the truck after the accident and confided to one person that he was driving the truck. Just weeks after what would have been Nicole Walker's 7th birthday, jurors delivered a verdict.
The defendant is guilty of vehicular homicide,
all right, please
leaving the scene of an accident with death as charged in the information. So say we all, this 20...
Because of Mr. Pierce's prior convictions, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison.
I'm very glad about that. This man had 7 priors in the state of Florida. He never once ever admitted to what he did. He's got so many priors back to 1952. And I'm sorry, I don't want this man in our society.
This case was the first time forensic animation had been admitted into evidence in a Florida court, and only the 3rd time in the United States.
Trial lawyers, whether they be criminal prosecutors or defense attorneys or civil lawyers, now have an opportunity to use a dynamic, new form of evidence to educate jurors about issues that are before them in courts all over this country.
But for the victims, Kenneth Pierce's behavior that night still raises questions for which there are few answers.
Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you stop? Why did you just hit kids, plow into them, leave them there to die in a puddle, and just keep on going? Just, you know, that's the biggest thing. Why? Why not just stop?
Well, this case involved the death of a little girl, and I became determined to ensure that justice was done for her. And Nicole Ray Walker's family blew up a photograph of their daughter and had a tear painted on her cheek. And they presented Detective Babcock and myself with a copy of this picture. And I have that picture in my office, and it sits there, and I view it every day because that photograph reminds me that justice can still be had in the criminal justice system. And the day that I don't feel that way anymore is the day that I'm going to take down her picture.
In 1998, a convenience store clerk in Lansing, Michigan was shot to death during a robbery. No one else was in the store at the time. But there was an eyewitness, a security camera. Unfortunately, the story it told was far from clear. Wanda Mason was a 48-year-old single mother of 3. She had worked in various cities across the country, trying, with mixed success, to build a stable life for her family. In 1997, she settled with her children in Lansing, Michigan. With money tight, she took a job at this convenience store gas station to make ends meet. About a year later, the owner decided to keep the store open 24 hours a day. Wanda Mason worked the very first overnight shift.
She was kind of struggling, and so when the gas station was looking for someone to work the overnight shift because they hadn't been open overnight for a while, Wanda just kind of jumped at it, and she worked the overnight shift so that she could be home with her family during the day and take care of her grandkids and that.
The store was located in a low-crime area, but as a precaution, a security camera was installed before the first overnight shift. A fresh videotape was unavailable, so workers used an old, worn-out tape until they could buy a new one. At 4:18 in the morning, a group of customers entered the store to pay for gas and found Wanda Mason in a pool of blood behind the counter. They called 911.
We just came in here and there's a lady that's bleeding to death. I don't know if she got robbed or what.
Is she conscious or
No, she's bleeding to death. I don't know if she's dead or what.
By the time emergency personnel arrived, Wanda Mason was dead with a single gunshot wound to the head. A spent .22 caliber long shell casing was next to the body. Police were surprised when Wanda's 21-year-old son, Donnie, came into the store just moments after they arrived. He showed up before police notified the family.
We got there was people there, and they told us that there was a lady laying behind the counter. So we went around back of the counter, and my mom was laying there, and I lost it. I went crazy. It was my mom. What do you expect? And I couldn't handle it. It was a tough thing to deal with.
The cash register showed that Wanda Mason had been killed for $351. Strangely, Wanda told family members just days earlier that she was not afraid to work the night shift because she had a plan in case she was robbed.
If anybody came in to rob the gas station or anything, because we discussed her working the overnight shift, I'm sure, well, I would just give them the money and get them out of there, you know, and deal with it later.
She said that if somebody tried to rob her, that she'd help them carry it to the car. It wasn't her money, and it wasn't worth her dying over. It wasn't no concern of hers, you know, that's the business's problem, not hers, and that was her whole outlook on it. It's not my money, and I'm not dying for it.
Police questioned everyone in the neighborhood and searched the store for clues.
We had officers set up a perimeter, and we got a canine track going. Now, a couple blocks away, officers spotted a guy running down the road with a paper bag in his hand, coming from the direction of the store. So they detained him and brought him back to the office so that we could talk to him. We were hoping that we had already got our guy.
The suspect, a 20-year-old African-American, was brought in for questioning. Was the security camera video clear enough to identify whether the suspect was the killer? When Wanda Mason was murdered in the convenience store where she worked, detectives turned to their one and only witness, the security video camera. Full action video is made up of 30 frames per second. But this security video was designed in time-lapse mode, which is only 4 frames per second. The result is an unstable image, which was compounded by the fact that it was recorded on an old, badly degraded videotape. Police sent the tape to Ed Cheney at Future Media Corporation.
When we played it, some of the pictures shifted and distorted, making the whole video sequence look unusable. But when we transferred the videotape to a broadcast video machine, we could then isolate the good images from the bad.
On the left-hand side of the screen, the tape shows a car pulling up to the store at 3:49 a.m. A man wearing a dark jacket enters the station and appears to be casing the area. He seems to notice Wanda Mason working in a back room. He then leaves without buying anything. Ten minutes later, the same man returns, this time with the hood of his jacket over his head. He goes straight to the back room beyond the range of the security camera. At gunpoint, he forces Wanda to the front counter. She opens the cash register and the man takes the money. He then steps back as if he's leaving. Trembling with fear, Wanda hides her face in her hands. Then, the man puts the gun to Wanda's head and fires. He lowers his hood, walks out of the store while stuffing the long-barreled pistol into his coat. Police had a suspect in custody, a man found running away from the scene with a bag in his hand. But the bag did not contain the stolen money, but candy, and he didn't have a gun. The young man said he was running from the scene because, as a young African American, he feared he would be wrongfully arrested. And he was right. The image on the videotape, though degraded, did not look like the suspect.
We compared the guy on the tape to the guy we had in custody at that time, and it was pretty obvious that they were not the same guy, so we had to cut him loose. And we felt like we had just taken our first giant step backwards in the investigation.
Investigators still had 2 pieces of evidence: the spent shell casing and the degraded image on the security camera videotape. With this image, police sketch artist Rod Sadler drew this composite drawing of the suspect. 3 days after the murder, it was released to the press.
Police say that early Saturday morning, this man entered the Marathon gas station in Holt and shot Wanda point blank in the head.
Tips poured into the police. But since the composite drawing of the suspect was based on the scratchy videotape image, it was difficult to know which tips were relevant and which were not.
When this case started out, all we had was the video. And you've seen the video, and if that's all you have, you're not feeling very good about your chances of ever resolving this case.
And while police continued their investigation, they were also suspicious of Wanda Mason's son, Donnie Warren. The videotape shows him highly agitated after seeing his mother's body. Investigators wondered why he was in the store in the middle of the night, just moments after the murder, before police had time to notify the family.
He showed up at the scene 10 minutes after the shooting. The police interviewed him, of course, immediately. He advanced the notion that the perpetrator was black, and how could he possibly have known that? That information had not been made public.
And one of the customers who found Miss Mason's body told us that Donnie was running around the front of the store saying, "I'm gonna kill that f***er." How did he know it was a lone black male when we hadn't even reviewed the tape yet?
Police discovered that Donnie Warren was unemployed with very little money. On the night of the murder, he was out drinking at a strip club.
We theorized that Donnie Warren may have met the killer at the topless bar where he and his buddies had been hanging out that night and spending money that they probably couldn't afford to spend. Knowing that his mother would not resist a robbery, that store may have seemed like an easy target where they could hit the store, split up the money, and nobody would get hurt.
Tips continued to pour in from people who thought they recognized the composite sketch. The question for police was whether this man was simply a random killer or someone connected to the victim's son.
Is she conscious at all? Is she conscious or
No, she's bleeding to death. I don't know if she's dead or what.
Police suspected that Wanda Mason's murder was a random act of violence. But police were suspicious when Wanda's son happened to walk into the store at 4 o'clock in the morning, just moments after the shooting.
Donnie and his friends just happened to show up a little too conveniently, right after the robbery, as if to console his mother.
Donnie denied having anything to do with his mother's murder, and he said his statement that an African American must have murdered his mother was simply an unfortunate remark. Nothing more than speculation said in anger. Police received a tip from a woman who said she recognized the police composite sketch of the killer on television. She identified the man as Ronald Leon Allen, her former boyfriend who lived in the nearby town of Jackson. Ron Allen was a small-time criminal with prior arrest for assault and drug activity. His mugshot resembled the police sketch and the individual on the security camera videotape.
We found out that Ronald Allen was a suspect in a shooting in Jackson, and the Jackson police had 2 .22 caliber shell casings from that shooting. We took those shell casings and the shell casing that we found near Wanda Mason's body to the crime lab to see if they may have been fired from the same gun.
Analysts said that the casings appeared to be from the same gun, but the only way to be sure was to test fire the actual gun for comparison, and police couldn't find it. Police also looked for a link between Ron Allen and Donnie Warren.
We tried everything we could think of to connect Donnie Warren to Ronald Allen, and every time we came up short. So we decided to put Donnie on the back burner and concentrate all our efforts on Ronald Allen.
Was Ron Allen the shooter? And could the videotape identify him? Allen was 5 feet 3 inches tall. What was the height of the shooter in the videotape? To find out, detectives went back to the store to recreate the murder. With gradated height charts set up around the store, and using the door and sunglass display as reference points, a height test was conducted using the same security camera, set at the same angle with the same framing that recorded the actual murder. When the test video was compared to the murder video, it showed that the shooter was 5 feet 4 inches tall. Ron Allen's mugshot was taken when Allen was in his stocking feet. With shoes, Allen would stand 5 feet 4 inches. Ron Allen voluntarily agreed to take a polygraph test.
Did you have anything to do with what is happening in the pictures? No.
He failed. At this point, police needed to make sure that Ron Allen was the man in the security videotape.
One of the things that we have encountered time and time again is you have a small business owner, and certainly they have limited resources, and they feel that they get some kind of protection by having a video camera set up, a security camera set up in their business. And certainly that should work as a deterrent to some criminals. But when someone commits a crime anyway, if you have cheap or substandard equipment, it's not going to be much help, if any, to law enforcement.
Once processed and transferred, investigators got a little better look at the killer. But would it be good enough? Even though investigators had a better image of Wanda Mason's killer, it still wasn't clear enough to make a positive identification with their suspect. The images were sent to Dr. Ron Carpinella at Veridian, an image reconstruction firm that worked to repair the digital images from the Hubble Space Telescope. Those pictures from outer space were badly flawed, but video reconstruction transformed those inferior images into viewable ones.
Well, there was an opportunity to take some of our technology that was developed under NASA and Department of Defense funding and apply it to a local problem.
The first step was to reduce the distortion in the images from the security videotape by building mathematical models of each image. These models identify the excess extraneous information, which is then eliminated, leaving only the essential information behind.
It's like focusing a camera. That's the process we were involved with. We had a set of algorithms that sharpen the image, read that as focusing the camera, or equivalently, it's like taking the thumbprint off your eyeglasses, clearing them up such that you can see with high definition what you're looking at.
Investigators now had a clean image, but the pictures were shot from a distance. In order to match the pictures to their suspect, investigators turned to forensic anthropologist Dr. Norm Sauer. He applied a technique called photo-skull superimposition. He took the mugshot of the suspect, Ron Allen, and superimposed it over the image taken from the security camera.
And what we were able to do is superimpose images on one another and compare aspects of morphology to evaluate the likelihood of an identification. Morphological features included things like the shape of the face, the shape of the eyes, the shape of the root of the nose was an important feature in this case, the distance from the root of the nose to the hairline.
Slowly, the images were laid on top of one another and revealed the identity of Wanda Mason's killer.
What he did was he identified the certain unique characteristics in the face in the video, which makes us each look different from anybody else. And he was able, by focusing on those different aspects of the face that are unique to an individual, was able to identify a mugshot of Ronald Allen as the perpetrator.
Prosecutors feared that defense lawyers would challenge the use of the processed videotape for identification. The only other evidence was the .22 caliber long shell casing found at the scene. Ron Allen's cousin was looking through some of Allen's stereo equipment when he noticed something behind the speaker cover. A long-barreled .22 caliber Ruger handgun.
We took the gun straight to the State Police Crime Lab, where tests confirmed that it was the gun that was used in both Wanda Mason's murder and the shooting in Jackson, and that was great news.
Police also discovered that Ron Allen owned an Oldsmobile Cutlass automobile that had been customized with expensive chrome wheels and a chrome rear view mirror. These same customized features could be seen on the vehicle outside of the convenience store after electronic enhancement. Ronald Allen was charged with first-degree murder. Police were satisfied that Donnie Warren had nothing to do with his mother's murder.
I was innocent, and there was no way they could possibly ever say that I wasn't. And I have faith in our justice system. I believe that, I know there's those few innocent people that slip through the cracks, but for the most part, if you're innocent, you'll be found innocent. They can only put you in prison if they have evidence, and when you're innocent, there is no evidence.
At the trial, the reconstructed video images provided a chilling account of the murder. The images were clear enough for a jury to look into Ronald Allen's eyes and see for themselves.
For me, I went through a whole range of just wanting them to die to wanting them to God only knows what, to now I'm kind of okay because I know life in prison ain't too awfully great.
All we had was the video, and you've seen the video, and if that's all you have, you're not feeling very good about your chances of ever resolving this case. But because of the tips, because of the work of Veridian and Future Media, and the interpretation and the abilities of Dr. Sauer, what we thought was nothing turned into enough that could have made the case itself.
Ronald Allen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. A measure of justice made possible by old-fashioned police work and the latest in forensic technology.
I really don't think Wanda's family knows how lucky they are that they got justice in this case. It's kind of ironic that the one thing that was supposed to make this easier for us turned out to be such a nightmare. Business owners have to understand that if they're going to use security equipment, they have to buy good equipment, they have to keep it clean, use new videotapes, and have good lighting so that we can get a good view of the suspect. They owe that to their employees, to the police agencies, and to the public.
I want people to know that Wanda was a good person that was doing a job to take care of her family. And she died for that. She died for no reason, no cause. And I am so glad that Ronald Allen's in prison for the rest of his life.
The family of Wanda Mason probably doesn't know the lengths and the detail and the creativeness that went into this conviction, but they don't have to know. And it's not our position in law enforcement to go and tell people what a great job we've done. Our job, people have elected me and the sheriff to protect them. They have elected us to arrest criminals, and they have elected me to do my best to convict them and protect the community. That was done in this case, and that's all that they need to know. That's what our job is, and we did our job.
At the start of the fall semester in 1995, a 23-year-old college co-ed, Tina Bigger, was reported missing. She had been working on a research project studying the health risks of high-priced call girls in Detroit. But she soon discovered that prostitutes face more than health risks in their job. They face the possibility of violence. Tina Bigger was a 23-year-old psychology major about to enter her senior year at Oakland University outside of Detroit. She was raised in a military family, and friends knew her as vivacious and hardworking.
Tina Bigger was the all-American girl. She came from a Coast Guard family. Her father was a Coast Guard commander. Her mother was a registered nurse.
The people who knew Tina and who were closest to her knew her as a very fun-loving, dedicated student, well-liked by all her peers and colleagues, and very much beloved by her family, a great big sister, a great daughter.
Tina worked her way through school as a waitress at the Rochester Chop House and lived with her boyfriend, Todd Nernberger, in an upscale apartment complex not far from school. Todd Nernberger was a student at the University of Michigan. The two had an on-again, off-again relationship, and friends weren't sure whether it would work out.
Tina also had another side to her. She could be distrustful, she could be vengeful. She had a temper at times, too. This was a Tina that not a lot of people who knew her saw.
Tina was conducting a research project for school entitled a survey of sexual history and health practices among women employed as escorts. She wanted to find out if high-priced call girls and street prostitutes had the same knowledge of sexually transmitted diseases.
She decided that she wanted to do her own study. She thought it would help her get into a good graduate school, and she decided to study high-class call girls and their awareness of AIDS, and then she was going to compare the two.
On August 23, 1995, Todd left for work. He said Tina was still asleep when he left. When he returned home that night, she was gone. Todd immediately phoned police.
Usually missing persons, the case is wrapped up within a couple days, maybe even a couple of hours. Usually phone calls could be made to determine where the person is or where they've been.
But from the start, this case was different. Tina's car was gone. None of her personal belongings were missing from the apartment. None of Tina's friends had seen or heard from her. And police also discovered that Tina was planning to move into her own apartment without Todd.
The fact that Tina was looking to move to another apartment, was actually in the process of looking to get into another apartment, led me to think that there was something wrong. That maybe I need to talk to Todd a little bit further about what was happening in their lives. Maybe that there was something I was missing.
Police learned that Tina found evidence that Todd was seeing another woman. And in an unexpected twist, police discovered that Tina was hiding some secrets of her own. 23-year-old psychology student Tina Bigger was a hard-working honor student who friends say had a promising career ahead of her. She disappeared without a trace shortly before the fall semester at Oakland University outside of Detroit. When her boyfriend Todd Nernberger called police to report her missing, police were naturally suspicious. The two had an on-again, off-again relationship. A few months earlier, Tina found a suggestive greeting card to Todd from another woman and realized that Todd had been unfaithful.
People had seen them fight sometimes. He was very devoted, but sometimes they had a very combustible relationship. He spent more time with her than anyone else. He probably knew her better than anyone else. He would seem like a natural suspect.
Despite their differences, Todd Nernberger denied any involvement in Tina's disappearance. Tina worked as a waitress at the Rochester Chop House.
Did Tina Bigger show up for work last night?
When Todd called to see if she had reported to work, he was told that Tina had quit her job 4 months earlier.
Okay, thank you.
Tina said nothing about quitting her waitressing job and had continued to launder her waitressing outfits as if nothing had changed. Todd searched their apartment, looking for some clue as to where Tina might have gone. Todd found a duffel bag he had never seen before. Inside were condoms, thigh-high stockings, lingerie, sexual lubricants, credit card slips, and envelopes addressed to the LA Escort Service with the name Crystal in the upper left-hand corner.
Hello? Do you have a girl that works for you named Tina Bigger?
The owners of the LA Escort Service said they didn't know anyone by the name of Tina Bigger, but they said that Crystal was the name of one of their more popular escorts. Escort services operate in most large cities, and offer female companionship to men in return for fees ranging from $150 to $300 per hour. Among the services provided is usually sex. Todd now began to suspect that Tina had been living a secret life as a high-priced call girl.
She decided she was going to do a study of high-class call girls and their awareness of AIDS. And she began contacting services, asking if she could talk to girls. She started doing that, and I think in the process became sort of enamored with what they were doing. I think in part it was the money. She was broke. She had maxed out her credit cards. She needed a new car. She had to pay for school. The money they make is a lot more than you make working at a steakhouse. At one point, she was making $250 for an appointment.
Maybe women have a little fantasy about themselves. Maybe all women do, and maybe she lived it out. I think she had a fantasy about herself. I think she wanted more attention in kind of a distant way. And being a call girl, she was getting it, because that's the kind of attention you get. Maybe it gave her power.
Hi, I'm Crystal.
After initially denying it, the escort service eventually admitted what Todd already suspected, that Tina Bigger worked as an escort with the professional name of Crystal. They also revealed that Tina worked for 2 other escort services and had dozens of clients. That also meant dozens of possible suspects. The investigation into Tina Bigger's disappearance revealed a dark secret. For the past year, Tina had been working as a high-priced call girl.
It was probably very important for Tina to keep this information, or what was going on in her life, away from her boyfriend, because she was living with him. He knew so much about her, but at the same time, if he had determined that she was involved with an escort service, actually working for one, obviously that would have caused a great deal of havoc in his life and their lives together.
He naturally was despondent. At one point, he even considered killing himself with a gun that he had. But he called some friends, they talked him out of it, and he decided basically that he was going to do whatever needed to be done, that he owed it to Tina to get to the bottom of what had happened to her.
Records from the escort service revealed numerous requests for Tina's services from a man named Ken Tranchita. Their first meeting took place at the Bluebird Motel just 12 days before Tina's disappearance. Among Tina's personal items found in her apartment was a love letter from Ken.
Dear Tina, my heart is yours for you to keep. Your love will lift me off my feet. You came to me, your love so willing. I know it's worth all our waiting. Love, Ken.
When police entered Ken Tranchita's apartment, they noticed the name Crystal on some artwork attached to his refrigerator. A local car dealer said Tina was with Ken Tranchita looking at new cars together.
Like it? Well, if you want it, it's yours.
And that Ken had offered to loan her money for the car.
Beautiful.
Ken Tranchita was a 42-year-old ex-convict with a history of passing bad checks, forgery, fraud, embezzlement, and theft. He was not the wealthy businessman he portrayed to Tina.
Sort of a drifter, a loner. He was a petty thief and a petty con man type of a person. He held down some menial jobs, but not for very long.
I thought he was just like kind of a little weasel, really. I don't know how else you would describe him. He had kind of a little voice, and he was sort of pathetic, really. He just was a guy who probably thought Tina was going to be his girlfriend or something.
Tranchita admitted meeting Tina Bigger, whom he first knew as Crystal, through the escort service. He said they later met without the agency knowing, and that Tina stopped charging him for their sexual liaisons since the two had become friends. He told police that he had driven Tina to the airport just 1 week earlier for a flight to Ohio, where she was going to service a client. A check of flight log showed no record of Tina Bigger on any flight to Ohio. Ken said Tina left her car with him for safekeeping while she was away. When police asked to inspect the car, Tranchita willingly obliged. Inside, police found names and addresses of more escort service clients, along with directions to their homes.
We had learned through paperwork found in her car and through the escort service that she actually had contact with people that were living out of the country. They were living out of state. So it was possible that she could have just taken off, gone someplace.
Although the trunk was filled with debris, a preliminary search found no evidence of foul play. Research shows that most first-time killers dispose of their victims' bodies in locations the killer is familiar with. So police used cadaver dogs to search areas near Tranchita's home. Michigan State Trooper Richard Hitu works with Kai, a veteran cadaver dog trained specifically to find human bodies. To train the dogs, the troopers hide a small sample of human tissue or fluid in their wooded training area.
The dog isn't rewarded for finding animal remains, but they're rewarded for finding human remains. So they're going to dig around a lot harder and look a lot harder because they're working for that reward.
Trooper Hitu and Kai searched wooded areas around Ken Tranchita's rented home, as well as the grounds of a nearby monastery where Tranchita often walked. Although they searched hundreds of wooded acres, they found nothing. With no evidence to hold Ken Tranchita, he was released from police custody. It was a mistake police would soon regret. After police questioned Ken Tranchita about the disappearance of Tina Bigger, he was released because of a lack of evidence, even though they suspected he knew more about her whereabouts than he had told them. It was clear that Ken's relationship with Tina was more than just business. Since a love letter from Ken was found in Tina's belongings, and Ken had promised to loan Tina the money for a new car.
If you want it.
Was he going to help her get a car? He made promises. He was probably telling her things to maybe make her hang on to him. Maybe she was making him think that they were friends, just to kind of get some of these things taken care of.
With no other leads, police decided to take a second look inside Tina's car. To their embarrassment, what they first thought were coffee stains on the side of a cup now appeared to be blood. And when they peeled back the trunk carpet, they found a pool of blood on the right-hand side. DNA tests revealed the blood belonged to Tina Bigger.
The investigation was already being looked at as a homicide, more so than perhaps another case might have been. But once they found that blood, there was really no question.
The amount of blood in the trunk pointed to murder. And since the car had been in Ken Tranchita's possession since Tina's disappearance, he was the prime suspect. But by this time, Ken Tranchita had vanished. Police finally got a break in the case 1 month after Tina Bigger disappeared. Ken Tranchita's brother suggested that police search a deserted home once owned by his aunt. The home was just 10 miles from Tina Bigger's apartment. In the woods, in the backyard, police found the badly decomposed body of a young woman. Since there were no pools of blood near the body, this told forensic scientists that the murder had taken place somewhere else. An analysis of dental records later revealed the body was that of Tina Bigger. Since the decomposition started in the neck area, the coroner suspected Tina had been strangled, since decomposition begins in the areas where there is bleeding at the time of death.
It was an unnatural cause of death. There was no fracture anywhere, even the head area. So neck has to be a place where the event happened, and we call it a neck trauma. I could not identify specific if neck was slashed, she was strangled, she was smothered. I cannot say that, but it has to be a neck injury, and that was the conclusion.
A nationwide manhunt for Ken Tranchita was now underway. Tranchita was eventually spotted in a rundown neighborhood in downtown Detroit. Police closed in. Ken made a weak attempt at slitting his wrists in the bathroom before giving himself up. After several hours of police interrogation, Ken Tranchita finally admitted that he and Tina had an argument over money.
You don't have the money to loan me, do you?
Of course I have the money.
I don't believe you.
The money is coming.
They had struggled, and Tina fell, hitting her head, and died. But X-rays of Tina's skull contradicted that scenario.
She did not have any skull fracture anyway. If she bled inside of the skull, I would have seen some blood staining inside of the skull, which was not present.
Although Tina may have suffered a head wound, as evidenced by the blood found in Tina's trunk, the wound was probably not fatal. When Tranchita was confronted with this information, his statement shocked police.
What he said was, Tina was just so miserable in those last days that I made a sudden decision to end it for her and put her out of her misery. The minute the police heard that statement, they thought, holy Jesus.
I pled guilty, Your Honor.
Ken Tranchita accepted a plea bargain and pled guilty to second-degree murder. Tina's family, reluctant to have Tina's double life made public, agreed to the deal. Prosecutors believe when Tina discovered Ken had lied to her about having the money to buy the new car, the two fought. Tina struck her head and was later strangled or smothered to death. Ken placed Tina's body in the trunk of her car, then dumped the body in the woods near his aunt's home. It was a tragic end to an unfortunate story. Ken Tranchita was sentenced to life in prison. Ironically, while Tina was living a life of deception, she too was deceived by Ken Tranchita, a con man offering the promise of a big loan.
If Tina was brought into this double life under some kind of illusion that it was going to be like a scene from Pretty Woman, and Richard Gere was going to come rescue her and, you know, bring her wonderful gifts, and she was going to fall into this opulent lifestyle, that's not the reality of the call girl world. You can meet up with some very desperate characters and some very bizarre characters. In this case, unfortunately, the person that she met up with was not Richard Gere, it was Ken. And where Tina ended up, lying in that field, is more the reality than the movie, I think.
She chose to cross the line, and she paid the ultimate price, which is what all of us as parents guard against and fear the most, I think, for our children.
And I believe by telling Tina Bigger's story that we sent a message to other girls who might be in the business, to other young women who might be thinking of going into the business, to young women who might think they can tease or play a little bit with a world that they don't belong in. I think that sends a message that you're asking for trouble, that you could end up in a situation that you can't handle, that you can end up dead.